Canada has just updated its travel advisory for Cuba, urging people to, quote, exercise a high degree of caution as that country faces widespread power outages. Roughly 1 million Canadians head down to Cuba every year. Tens of thousands of people in Canada are part of the Cuban community. Well, now the impacts of a U.S. blockade on supplies that get into that country is making it even more difficult to get fuel or reliable electricity right across the island nation. Joining us for more this morning is Isaac Saini. He's a professor at Dalhousie University and author of Cuba, A Revolution in Motion. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You know, we know the headlines of this, but give us a sense of what is happening on the ground in Cuba. How does this impact, before we talk tourists, let's talk about how it impacts the everyday life and safety of people who live there.
Well, Cuba continues to be a very safe country, but the impact of Trump's attempt to deny Cuba fuel is long blackouts. I'm talking to a lot of my friends in Cuba, enduring blackouts of 17 hours and then having a few hours of electricity as the Cuban government tries to ration electrical supplies so that everyone can have electricity. It's going to impact on transport, people being able to get around, as well as transporting food from the farms, from the rural areas into the city. This can only be described as an economic war that the United States is waging against Cuba, and particularly targeting what is the Achilles heels of so many countries, oil supply and fuel. Most countries import oil, and the United States is making it exceedingly difficult for Cuba to actually import oil, threatening countries with tariffs and even threatening a naval blockade of Cuba. And it's important to understand that for over 30 years, the international community has condemned this over decade-long economic war the United States has waged against the island, and with the latest measures, executive order by the Donald Trump administration, the international community has once again come out in a chorus of condemnation.
Isaac, let me just ask you, because this has happened in Cuba for decades. You mentioned in part because of the sanctions that were placed against them by the U.S., that oftentimes the cities, and in particular the tourist areas, will get a lot of the resources. And then as you trickle out or as you expand out into the rural areas, less and less becomes available. But what does that look like in Cuba now? If they already were struggling, how are they surviving now?
Well, Cubans are surviving because of a significant amount of social solidarity that exists in the country. And I would argue a government that, in a sense, is committed to ensuring that the pain is spread as equally as possible across the country in terms of sharing the limited supplies that it has, right? Cuba is also recovering from the impact of Hurricane Melissa. So there's a concatenation of issues that have happened. So one of the things is basically, one, to make sure that the limited resources that Cuba has, right, is shared among individuals, but there's also a tremendous amount of social cooperation and social solidarity among Cubans. The United States, and it's clear, it's been an articulated policy since April 6th of 1916, of infamously classified memo from the U.S. State Department, is to starve Cuba of fuel and supplies to generate hunger and desperation, right? And in the latest iteration of this economic war against Cuba, we have, Rubio, we have Trump, we have other members of the U.S. Congress who have this virulent anti-Cuba hatred, declaring that their goal is to starve Cuba of oxygen, to make the people desperate. And this is a form of collective punishment. It's completely illegal and morally nefarious under any form of international law and convention, which is why we have an international chorus condemning it.
Isaac, what do you think the Trump administration's long-term goal is here? If the short-term goal is to make the people feel desperation, where do they go from there? Like, what's the ultimate end goal?
Well, I think the ultimate end goal of the U.S. policy is sort of twofold. I mean, there may be other factors. One, for over 60 years, Cuba has resisted the United States. Cuba asserted its independence. The United States wishes to control all the countries in the region. And so they wish, in a sense, to punish Cuba for over 6 decades of resistance, of preserving its independence, with all the contradictions up and downs that Cuba has had. But more importantly, with the latest iteration of the national security document, this infamous document that came out, perhaps the most scrutinized national security document ever coming out of the United States, the U.S. has made it very clear there's been no covering up of it, no sugarcoating, no euphemistic language. They claim that the Western Hemisphere belongs to them. They must have complete hegemony, and all governments must, in a sense, follow their diktat. And so, in a sense, what they want to do with Cuba is Cuba will be an example to other countries, which is why many people who support Cuba, who in things such as the Cuba Solidarity Movement, understand, for example, that defending Cuba's independence independence now, defending Cuba from this unrelenting, ceaseless, and ever-escalating U.S. economic war is part and parcel of defending Canadian independence, because Trump has also threatened Canada. We know about the 51st state rhetoric that he's spoken about. So right now, it's about, I think, crushing a country that's been defiant, and the United States cannot stand that. But also, it's also about setting an example to the rest of the region that the U.S. is determined to exercise utter domination, if not complete hegemony in the area.
Isaac, very quickly, because we are very short on time, but with the government telling tourists to travel with a high degree of caution, what's your advice then to anybody who either has plans or was planning to make them?
Well, I was just actually talking to somebody who was just in Cuba just recently, right? Because tourism is a very important source of foreign exchange for Cuba, you need to have hard currency in order to purchase the food, the fuel, and other things that Cuba needs. Tourism is very important to Cuba, and in fact, I've heard that some planes going down were quite packed and so forth, and the Cuban government is doing all it can to put in measures to ensure that tourists are not affected by this latest episode and dimension of the U.S. economic war against Cuba. I would encourage Canadians to travel to Cuba. It's a form of defiance against this frightening U.S. economic policy, against this frightening attempt of the United States to impose its complete domination in the region under the new principle which violates all sorts of international law, all sorts of international morality that might makes right. So by traveling to Cuba, Canadians can actually not only help Cuba, but they're also helping defend independent sovereignty in the region.
Isaac Saini, professor at Dalhousie University, appreciate you joining us this morning. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
If you like that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.